Welcome to a live stream of the Canadian Culture Wars reports. I'm going to try this. Last time I tried this, it went absolutely haywire, but I think it looks like it's going to work this time. I'm Melanie Bennet, if I need to introduce myself. And on this channel, I usually like to talk about issues to do with education, especially activist education. And I had this whole thing set up for today, and then something popped into my YouTube feed that I could not resist. But first, just a slight announcement. As some of you may or may not know, Trump has made a lot of EOs or executive orders, put a lot of them out for gender, for women's rights, and to de-radicalize education. So well done. I put a post on Twitter. It's pinned to my account. And I sort of go through some of the highlights in there, and he's really done a great job. His team has done a really fantastic job. But I don't really want to go over too much of that today, only to say it was super fantastic. I couldn't imagine anything better. He's really going root and stem, getting rid of it all. But there's one little thing that was conspicuously missing, considering they were so thorough in the executive order. And that was unions. They didn't mention teachers' unions, which I found really curious. And then this documentary that I'd heard of, that I'd told myself I should watch at some point, from the Communist Party of Canada, put out this documentary about their 100 years of history that apparently talks about unions. I've had a little look, and it does, but I haven't watched it. So it's interesting because also today, the Prime Minister of Canada, not today, sorry, the tariff war apparently is coming today. I haven't really seen the tariffs kickstart yet, but certainly our Prime Minister has been doing his little thing for a tariff war. And just to remind you, if you haven't seen it, he's put out this little post here saying, when we renegotiated our trade agreement with the US, unions were right there with us. They made sure it was a good deal for workers. Now we're fighting to protect it, and the unions are right there with us again. So he's a fan of unions. Let's just Unifor is like, yeah, so Unifor is like a monopoly. Well, they're more like oligopolies. They're just massive unions. And so they're obviously in support of this tariff war. I wonder why. So we're going to talk about unions today. And isn't it interesting that our government is so pro-unions? And by the way, like I'm not anti-union. I'm just going to point this out. I think Canada's unions have become something else than what people expect a union to be. It's not just advocating for workers' rights. There's a whole other thing behind it. And I'm hoping that this documentary is going to shed quite a lot of light on that. So without further ado, let's watch. I might pause a little bit to comment here and there, but mostly I just thought if I'm going to watch it, you guys can come watch it with me. Yeah, so let's bring this up. I put a link of this documentary if anybody wants to go watch it for themselves. But yeah, grab a drink, grab some popcorn. Let's go.
It's more difficult to be revolutionary when the conditions are not revolutionary. When people are filled with reformist ideas and reformist illusions.
There was this impression that Marxism was dead, socialism was dead, and by extension, communist parties were dead as well. And in fact, we know that some communist parties actually did disappear.
You can't kill an idea. And the idea of people having a society in which the means of production are not owned by a parasitic class, that idea is, you can't kill it.
A lot of us came out, kind of battle scarred.
It may suffer defeat, setback, but ultimately, in the competition between capitalism and socialism, ultimately, socialism will win.
Well, we live at a moment in human history when it's quite clear capitalism has absolutely nothing left to offer the people of this planet.
This is a class war.
Change is definitely in the air.
You might say that we were a little bit ahead of our time.
We are going to fight like hell for every single policy I've read here and some that aren't here.
The party has a real history of struggle in this country.
We are a revolutionary party striving to win the people of this country for socialism.
I remember very well going to my party club and meeting comrades, some of whom were in the Mackenzie-Papineau brigades fighting against fascism in Spain, people who were in the forefront of building the trade union movement.
When I think back on my life in the party, it just seems like a blur. We were involved in so many things, almost every major campaign.
When I joined the Communist Party of Canada in 1959, the Cold War was in full state.
Taking our country out of the camp of imperialist war and fitting it into the camp of peace and progress towards socialism.
I feel I've never been anything but a member of the Communist Party.
I believe in socialism, and I believe that when you attain socialism, you should defend socialism.
A movement that isn't just through time, and our party has 100 years, and I'm part of that 100 years, and that's what feels significant to me, is this connectivity to history, but also through space.
Vive la solidarité internationale!
You know, it's not just a rhetorical slogan to say that we really are an internationalist movement, that we are one large family worldwide.
My roots are in India. My head is in Canada.
Oh, I just want to say this film is 3 years old. So they had the Free Palestine 3 years ago. This is from 2021. And they pointed out that their socialism, this communism, is a global socialism, which is opposed to a national socialism, which, let's not get into it. But the national socialists and the global socialists, they don't like each other very much.
But my heart is in you.
Jim continued the fight for national liberation for the Indigenous peoples right up to the end of his life in the late 1960s. He's an inspiration for all of us who have Métis families in our backgrounds, and for all party members, in fact, that we've been in this struggle for almost our entire century.
I was infused with that worldview, you know, like which class do you belong to?
And there was quite a campaign.
Someone asked me, why are you running? Is it to raise issues, or do you want to get elected? And I said, I want to be elected.
The party has made it possible for me to follow my star. That is to say, to devote my life to work for my ideal, for socialism. And how many people have an opportunity to give every day of their lives to work for something they believe in?
I'm telling you that it's the party of the future. It's the only party that they can actually save the world, in my opinion.
For 100 years, the Communist Party of Canada has been at the forefront of the struggle for socialism. It is a party of the working class and stands for the emancipation of all humanity from capitalist exploitation and oppression, colonial plunder, imperialist war, poverty, and ignorance. The Communist Party of Canada is not only Canada's second oldest political party, it is very nearly as old as socialist internationalism itself. On November 7th, 1917, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or Bolsheviks, led tens of millions of workers and peasants in a successful revolution, grabbing the attention of the world and changing the course of history. For the first time, a socialist government had seized and now held power. The Russian Revolution was a threat to capitalism worldwide, and Canada was no exception. Across Canada, the socialist movement grew apace of revolutionary progress abroad and deepening contradictions between classes at home. But while many Canadian workers affiliated with communist parties in the United States, there was no communist centre in Canada until May of 1921, when a group of men and women declared the founding of the Communist Party of Canada. In the words of Tim Buck, who would become General Secretary of the party in 1929, the idea of a party aiming to meet the standards developed by the genius of Lenin was achieved by revolutionary Canadian workers and intellectuals under the direct inspiration of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party.
The labor movement is the organized working class. It's not the whole working class, but it's the organized working class. And it's like a training ground for class consciousness. The labor movement by itself would never take up the fight for socialism. The labor movement, if left alone, would be economism, what Lenin called economism.
Did you just say that if the labor movement were left alone, if the communists hadn't infiltrated the labor movement, it would be economist, I think you said? I want to see that again.
Achieved by revolutionary Canadian workers and intellectuals under the direct inspiration of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party.
The labor movement is the organized working class. It's not the whole working class, but it's the organized working class. And it's like a training ground for class consciousness. The labor movement by itself would never take up the fight for socialism. The labor movement.
Okay, I think this is going to be the theme of the documentary, that the labor movement wasn't originally communist or socialist, but that it sort of was taken over by communists in the did he say the 1920s? Anyway, we'll watch. Fascinating.
Movement, if left alone, would be economism, what Lenin called economism. They'll fight for wages, better working conditions, a bigger piece of the pie. Marx and Engels and people like Lenin injected ideology into the working class. So the role of the party in the trade union movement is linked intrinsically, because it's the communists who will give the later labor movement politics and direction. And the labor movement, like I say, is a breeding ground for class consciousness. So it becomes a very important component in any social movement or revolutionary movement. But the ideology has to be carried into it. And that's the value of the Communist Party. That's why we call ourselves the Vanguard Party. Not because of our size, but because of the importance of scientific socialism and what we can bring into the struggle.
But socialists weren't the only people observing the Russian Revolution with interest. In 1917, the Government of Canada had expanded the War Measures Act to outlaw left-wing organizing, clearly concerned about a homegrown revolution. Thus, under surveillance and duress, the first Congress of this party of a new type took place in secret on a small farm of 5 acres outside Guelph, Ontario.
Guelph?
In Fred Farley's barn, delegates from centres across the country met at great risk with an appointed sentry on the lookout for police. Out of this mix of disparate yet related economic, geographical, cultural, ethnic and social backgrounds of town and country, out of these men and women shaped by personality, temperament, education, physical and intellectual condition, youth and age, was formed the first generation of the Communist Party of Canada.
Alors évidemment, à sa fondation à Guelph, dans des conditions de clandestinité, le Parti communiste reconnaît l'existence d'une nation canadienne-française. On retrouve dès la fin des années 20 des documents officiels du parti qui justement soulignent la nécessité de recruter auprès de la classe ouvrière francophone à travers le pays, mais en particulier au Québec. Et ça dénote évidemment d'une préoccupation particulière au sujet de la question nationale. Et évidemment, ça porte fruit puisque le Parti communiste est très actif dans les années 20-30, en particulier après le crack de 1929, très actif à Montréal en particulier, mais aussi partout à travers le Québec.
Well, my grandfather came out to Port Moody when he was 7 years old and walked up the Port Moody Hill with his dad, who had arrived before him, started out in the Flavel Cedar Mill out in Port Moody, and used to deliver party papers around Port Moody area. He ended up in a big strike out at Millardville and ended up being the strike spokesperson, you might say. And out of that, his popularity grew, and he ended up becoming the founding president of the IWA. Most of his friends were fellow travelers, people in the Communist Party of Canada. And when he founded the IWA, he was going back and forth down into the States and speaking in front of 2 and 3 and 4 and 10,000 people all the way down to Louisiana, organizing the IWA. It really built a foundation for working, people that a lot of us don't really know that in today's working world about the foundations that were built back in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And when he became the president of IWA, the International Woodworkers of America, one of his cohorts was the founding president of the Longshore Union, Harry Bridges. And Harry Bridges was the founding president of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union. And together they sat on the first CIO with John L. Lewis in as the president. And Harry was a fellow traveler. My grandfather was in, the party. The boss hounded them. The government hounded them. The CIA hounded them. They tried to throw Harry out of the country, I don't know how many times. He used to come up to Vancouver in the 60s, 70s and sleep on our couch out in the East End and tell me stories about what it means to be a working stiff your whole life and what it means to be exploited. One thing that I've really recognized over my life.
We literally just heard the other guy saying that they'd infiltrated the labor unions because they were going, economism is what they were doing. So they had to exploit the working class to develop their class consciousness. And now he's complaining about exploitation. Oh my God, I love this.
Lifetime is how influential the party was on building unions, not only in Canada and British Columbia, but also down through the United States as well. And a lot of that was really built upon internationalism about recognizing workers around the world. Mine, mill, longshore, loggers, city workers, boilermakers, mill workers, they were all represented by members of the party here in, BC. So there was good collaboration and interaction, not only for reform for working people, but also for the bigger perspective about nationalizing key sectors of the economy. And the party was the only union that's actually called for that over its proud history of this 100 years.
This party would draw from the rich ferment of anti-war and...
So I want to comment on this. Labor unions have always been communist. I used to think that too, and they haven't. It was not communist until, they even just said at the beginning of this film that it wasn't up until the 1920s when they were infiltrated by the Communist Party. And I've read a lot of archived Communist International type articles from Marxist.org, which it's a massive, massive archive of communist literature. And they talk about infiltrating the trade unions, the labor unions too, in there. So the labor unions themselves weren't always socialist. They definitely have been taken over by the socialists. And at this time would have been class consciousness that they were trying to develop or whatever. But they weren't always communist.
Labor organizing in cities across the country, and the recent memory of general strikes in Winnipeg and Vancouver, coal miners' strikes in Alberta and Nova Scotia, and hundreds of industrial disturbances in opposition to the First World War. More than 350,000 workers went on strike between the years of 1917 and 1920, and thousands of them came to the Communist Party over the next decade. Many of these founding members were immigrants who faced xenophobia in their everyday lives and deportation as a consequence of organization, and yet were undeterred from the urgent work of organizing revolution.
The person that signed me up was named Harry Hunter. And Harry Hunter was the original employee in Canada from the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. It was formed after
The steelworkers, they're one of the worst.
After the split with the FFL, when the CIO was formed in the late 30s. And the head of the miners' union, John L. Lewis, met with Williams A. Foster, a prominent American communist at the time, because he needed organizers. And William Foster said we can provide 400 organizers from the Communist Party of the USA. So John L. Lewis hired 400 organizers, and they formed the Steelworkers Organizing Committee before there was a Steelworkers Union. And Harry Hunter was the first employee in Canada of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee for the CIO. And they worked on organizing Stelco. Actually, the first local union in Canada was Local 1004, was at Dofasco. That local was broken, and Dofasco is still not organized to this day, but the successful organizing was in Stelco. And prominent people working for the Steelworkers Organizing Committee at that time were a guy named Harry Hamburg, Harry Hunter, and Bert McClure. They're all members of Local 105 IBEW. They were all electricians. And the IBEW local was part of the AFL, but they defied the AFL and they took part in industrial organizing and took part in the Trades and Labor Council in Canada. So these people were icons. And when I joined the party, they were still very active, prominent members of the party. So I've had that connection with the past generation, which I'm very thankful for. And these were very wise people. And when I joined the party, the collective of the party was very strong in industry here in Hamilton, particularly in the United Electrical Workers Union, which represented UE and 3 factories here. Peggy McClure acted as a secretary for all these people, and that was an unpaid job. So the party was very prominent and important in the industrial unionism that developed, particularly in Canada after the Second World War.
We have also played
Okay, I have to stop it here. What has he just said? He was talking about the steel workers. He was talking about Hamilton specifically, and he was talking about the electrical workers. Now, so many of the people or the organizations that he mentions, I've actually been covering, I guess you could say. So in 2023, in September 2023, there was the Million March for Children. If you're aware of it, that's great. If you're not, basically parents across the country in Canada stood up in their local towns or cities in the probably tens of thousands across the country. I think it must have been outside of the trucker protest. It must have been one of the largest protests in Canada. And it was just ordinary people saying they didn't want gender ideology in school anymore. Anyway, so I'm going off on a tangent here just to say, right before this Million March for Children, about 15 unions, the heads of presidents and vice presidents of either the national, provincial, or locals met, and a Zoom call that they had was leaked. And oh my God, let me just see if I can find very quickly for you. I actually created a playlist on my YouTube channel of some of the interesting bits of that Zoom call, if you want to go have a look at some of these here. But another thing I wanted to point out, these are not all of them from that Zoom call, but there's links in there that you can go find for yourself if you're interested in that. But also he mentioned the electrical IBEW, which is the electrical unions. Now, that's a really interesting thing to mention because before the Million March, just after the Million March, Billboard Chris had a protest in Toronto, in Scarborough. And one of the members of that union, IBEW, this Galen Cramsey here, got himself in a bit of a tizzy when let me just turn off the volume here. Basically, this footage here of this guy, Galen Cramsey from the IBEW, being sent in as a Black Bloc Antifa to beat up a 16-year-old kid. So these are the unions that the communist guy from the Communist Party here, this retiree or whatever, is celebrating. So isn't that interesting? Let's go back to watching.
a big role in the struggle for women's rights. When others were not as keen about that question as they are today, there's been a revolution in thinking in that. We formed women's labor leagues in British Columbia and raised up the whole question of equal rights for women in the 30s.
And our party has a proud record of trying to organize women and men and women to participate in the struggles and to fight for equality.
Occasionally look through some files and I find pictures of the kids at 3, 4, 5, 6 on the picket line.
Our children were all raised the same ways, and some chose to become activists in the labor movement and the party. Others didn't, but they all know which class they belong to.
Socialist. We tried to organize a union so people could have representation in the life and what was happening to them. We succeeded in Vancouver to organize a legal office I was working in.
Throughout the late 20s, communists helped to establish the Industrial Union of Needle Trades Workers as part of a massive movement to organize the unorganized and to advance the rights of women within labor. As organizer Annie Buller, a founding member of the Communist Party, would explain,
the dressmakers could not persuade the officials of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, then looked upon by the workers as a company union, to organize them and help abolish these frightful conditions. The so-called leader's reply was, "You cannot organize women." Thus, in 1929, the dressmakers took their destiny into their own hands and started to build a union that would defend their living standards and abolish the outrageous sweatshop conditions.
Not just a movement, but a significant movement, a powerful movement, a movement that has actually accomplished certain achievements. I mean, they made international.
Okay, this lady's a retired teacher and professor, anti-racist activist. I think that's a really, really, really important to note, because I see so many teachers. Well, she's retired, but I see so many teachers in basically just flagrant Marxist. But I actually paused it because I think there were sweatshop conditions, and we do need the public to organize themselves against that kind of tyranny coming from an oligarchy. That is a thing that does exist. So I actually think there's a place for labor unions. I don't think they should be communist and we should root it out. I'm a big fan of McCarthy. But there is a place for labor unions, because without them, workers would still be exploited they might still be exploited in the ways that they were previously. So in that sense, I'm not anti-labor union. I'm anti-communist.
National Women's Day come to the fore in places like Canada and the United States. And that didn't happen just out of the movement here. It came from an international movement of communist women through the Women's International Democratic Federation, which our movement in Canada was part of. The Congress of Canadian Women were part of the Women's International Democratic Federation, which had consultative status at the United Nations and played a significant role in fighting for women's rights around the world.
On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Communist Party of Canada sprang into action. On the prairies, communists organized the Farmers' Unity League to propagate a clear pronouncement of the class struggle within every existing organization of farmers. Shoulder-to-shoulder boycotts of farm sales became a show of collective strength. At these attempted repossessions, neighbors stood strong, and no bid would exceed $1. As auctioneers and landlords became increasingly enraged, bankrupt farmers would have their belongings restored on the spot. In Winnipeg's North End, the Workers and Farmers Cooperative Association operated a fuel yard, a lumber yard, a public garage, and 2 dairy plants, uniting and organizing the unemployed. In January of 1930, the Communist Party established the Workers' Unity League, a militant trade union federation that would organize thousands of workers. In 1934, there were 189 strikes across the country. 109 of these were led by the Workers' Unity League, and 84 ended in victory. These were years of hard-earned successes and grisly repression, as the Workers' Unity League was virtually alone in pushing for union action during the brutal years of the Great Depression. In Estevan, Saskatchewan, the RCMP opened fire on striking miners, killing 3 people. Annie Buller spoke to a room full of miners ringed by police, whom she called cowards to their faces.
That yellow stripe on your pants goes right up your back.
Buller was charged with inciting a riot and sentenced to a year of hard labor. Her only crime was telling the truth in the fight for working people. While in solitary confinement, Buller smuggled letters to her son, written on toilet paper, and as soon as she was released, she resumed organizing.
They were all great people. I loved traveling around the province. We had people who were very important in the National Farmers Union, people who were influential in the Métis movements, leading people in the trade unions in Saskatchewan. They were all people who'd been through really inspiring, difficult struggles, and they had a lot to teach me, and I loved being there.
See, this is the thing about communists, right? Like a lot of the things that they're talking about, whether it's women advocating for themselves in the workplace or whether it's Indigenous people advocating for themselves in society in general, these are not bad things. But then when the communists take over, they kind of take this attitude that the only way to advocate is through the socialist stuff. And they end up kind of ruining it for everybody. And I think that we can remove these. We can be very, very anti-communist and still have progress in society.
In 1931, a number of high-profile Communist Party members, including General Secretary Tim Buck, were charged with sedition under Section 98A of the Criminal Code, introduced during the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 to ban unlawful association. At the same time, the state seized the assets of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, the Federation of Russian Canadians, the Finnish Organization of Canada, the United Jewish People's Order, and others, immigrant organizations with strong socialist affinities and close ties to the Communist Party. In February 1932, Buck and 7 other leaders of the Communist Party were imprisoned in Kingston Penitentiary.
Good.
Their trial and subsequent imprisonment, during which Buck survived an assassination attempt in his cell, was dramatized in the 1933 play 8 Men Speak, a passionate indictment of the repressive government of R.B. Bennet. The play was censored immediately after its first and only performance in December 1933. The Kingston 8 were released separately over the course of the next year, and finally, on November 24, 1934, Tim Buck walked free on a single day's notice, arriving in Toronto to a reception of 25,000 working people at Maple Leaf Gardens. The Great Depression raged unabated through these years. The month after Buck's release, a 2-month strike commenced in Vancouver, British Columbia, as men converged upon the city in response to the abject conditions of government relief camps throughout the province. By April 1935, over 1,000 striking workers, organized by the Workers' Unity League, set out for the capital on boxcars. The On to Ottawa trek had begun. By June,
Did they have a trucker protest? Except it wasn't truckers. It was a convoy of what was a convoy of what?
Was made that 8 representatives of the group would continue on to Ottawa, while the rest of the strikers would remain in an encampment on the city's exhibition grounds. In Ottawa, the delegation was insulted by Prime Minister R.B. Bennet, and they returned to a fraught situation in Saskatchewan. Police provoked a riot and violently suppressed the trekkers, arrested 140 and injured hundreds more. But this watershed event accelerated an irreversible movement for work and a social wage.
Okay, that's super interesting. So they call them the trekkers. This, again, was 3 years ago. So that was before the trucker convoy. So this is not on purpose that they call them trekkers. But the trekkers were basically like the convoy truckers who were marching or, trekking to Ottawa to make it known that they were against whatever was going on. But isn't it funny that it's okay when the socialists do it, but it's not okay when non-socialists do it? That's really interesting. They call them the trekkers as well.
Trekkers' fight for unemployment insurance goes down in history as a moment of collective strength and ingenuity.
issue because it's changed significantly for the worse. Not that it was very good before, but we've never been involved directly in a U.S. dirty war. And everyone knows that the election that was held for President Maduro was one of the cleanest elections of any country in the world. They can't hide that. There were international observers there. And they don't.
Hugo Chavez, People's Defense Front of Toronto, they have eggs on their faces. Venezuela's not doing too great right now with their suppression of free speech and all that.
Don't like the election because they don't like the result of the election. And that's what this is about. But this is also part of a bigger project for U.S. imperialism. They are not just looking at Venezuela. They're looking at all of South and Latin America and the Caribbean because they cannot stand, they won't stand for governments and peoples who try to exert their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, their right to choose their own government and choose what.
This guy had a sign that says, "From Venezuela to Palestine, occupation is a crime," which is the same kind of chanting that you hear from all of these protesters today. But again, that was in 2021. That was like well before all of this stuff kicked off.
What kind of economic and social future they want for themselves. So enough is enough. And Canada has to stop this. It's got to, if they're not prepared to step back because of public pressure and demonstrations like this one, and we have to come back again with more people and make sure they know this is a sentiment of the Canadian people as a whole, then we're going to have to change the government. It's time. We need a government that will have a foreign policy of peace, disarmament, and that will recognize the rights of other countries to determine their own future, free of intervention from the U.S. and from Canada. And what do we say? Hands off Venezuela! Hands off Venezuela!
I had met in my life the greatest humanist on
look,
earth,
another teacher.
and it is Fidel. I shook hand with him, and we had some words with him and from me, and he did ask, I've been told you are very passionate in Cuba. Why? Then I told him, because it is the revolution. I'm revolutionary and communist. It is the revolution which is I find is the very dear to me because it is a third world country revolution, and it embraces Asians, Africans, and Europeans, and thus it is very unique for me. If anybody asks what is the most meaningful practical work I did, it is solidarity with Cuba. And I have already said on one occasion that my roots are in India, my head is in Canada, but my heart is in Cuba.
I also think, too, that meeting comrades around the world who have made
education
the
again.
ultimate sacrifice, whether they have been jailed, whether they have been imprisoned, tortured, or unfortunately killed for their beliefs, only solidified for me that it has often been communists with an international perspective who have led the charge, the demand for human and civil rights, the demand for equality, the demand for socialism.
Okay, he's got a good point there. This is a problem that I've noticed, is that the communists or socialists or Marxists or neo-Marxists, critical theorists, whatever you want to call them, those of the far left who want this like international collectivism or whatever, they definitely have been addressing social issues, whatever they call human rights, civil rights. They've sort of taken over that conversation, leftists in general. And so that's not been very great. We're in this situation in Canada that is tyrannical, it's absolutely tyrannical, because in my opinion, whoever is not a communist appears to have sort of allowed these people to take over social issues. And we have a bit of a problem because of that. So he's right. They have taken over the conversation in human rights and defending people and so on and so forth. So much to the point that any kind of defense on social issues or any kind of discourse on social issues, is either that the proper speech in that has to be of a socialist variety, or it gets decried as hate speech. Now, education, this keeps coming up. There's a lot of educators and teachers, and that's no mistake. But in education, think about this being pushed onto our kids, and it's the human rights tribunals are using their whatever power that they have, which are probably full of neo-Marxists as well, to push this stuff into education. So yeah, they're right. They have taken over that conversation.
On a global scale.
The Communist Party of Canada has been internationalist from the first. As the Spanish Civil War between Franco's fascist coup and the Popular Front government escalated in 1936, more than 1,500 Canadians joined the fight, many of them members of the Communist Party of Canada. The Mackenzie Papineau Battalion fought in many key battles and suffered great losses, which remain uncommemorated by the Government of Canada to this day. Party member Dr. Norman Bethune offered much-needed medical assistance, innovating a mobile blood transfusion unit that saved thousands of lives. Bethune would go on to volunteer with Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party in their struggle against the Japanese invaders, where he would die after an infection contracted during a battlefield surgery. But his words and deeds live on today. Are wars of aggression, wars for the conquest of colonies, then just big business? Yes, it would seem so. However much the perpetrators of such national crimes seek to hide their true purpose under banners of high-sounding abstractions and ideals, they make war to capture markets by murder, raw materials by rape. They find it cheaper to steal than to exchange, easier to butcher than to buy. This is the secret of war. This is the secret of all wars. Behind all.
This is unintentionally really, really funny.
Stands that terrible, implacable god of business and blood whose name is profit. Money, like an insatiable Moloch.
Money like an insatiable Moloch, an evil devil.
Demands its interest, its return, and will stop at nothing, not even the murder of millions, to satisfy its greed. Behind the army stand the militarists. Behind the militarists stand finance capital and the capitalist, brothers in blood, companions in crime. These men make the...
This is so conspiratorial. I mean, there's some issues in the world, but this is like all of these bad actors are coming to get you, and only the communists can save the world because they're the good guys, and all of these other people who are conspiring against you, they're evil, they're the bad guys. When he's talking about money is Moloch and then showed a picture of, was it Dachau? Oh my God.
Wounds.
It seems to me that in these elections today, that we must keep in mind the nature of the time in which we live. These elections in your country and other countries may well determine the whole future of our world. What is the nature of that world? A world that has been built on a struggle for the common people. A world which has just almost smashed the forces of fascism.
Yeah, anything that
which, however, are attempting to emerge again. And strange to say, emerging with the help of some of the great leaders of our time, who, in the first stages, said pretty words about the destruction of fascism. I need call no names, but we must be careful in our own country, in England and in your Canada. And there can only be a realization of the kind of world we want if we send to Parliament those who have a record of uncompromising fight for the people in the largest sense. Such a person is Tim Buck, a man who has suffered all the way for the things in which he believes. Yes, a man who stands for people taking over their own destiny, one who stands firmly for the cooperation of all the allied nations, for a complete understanding between the peoples of Canada, for example, and the allies who have fought in this war, especially with the Soviet Union. One of the leading nations, again, in the struggle for democratic principles. I trust that you will send Tim Buck to your parliament and let him fight for you.
Over the next decade, the Communist Party made remarkable gains for working people in a political system from which they were officially excluded, operating as the United Progressive Movement or as the Labour Progressive Party. In the 1930s and beyond, communists like Jacob Penner in Winnipeg and Harry Rankin in Vancouver would advance a working-class platform in city council. And in 1940, Saskatchewan organizer Doris Nielsen became the first communist elected to Parliament. In her first speech to the House of Commons, she charged that
while over 50% of the voters are women, we can only have one representative of our sex in the House.
I remember Stanley Ryerson being at our house. I must have been 7 years old. He came for a meeting, and my father introduced me to him. And he signed his book, Le Canada Français, dedicated it to me. I still have the book. There's a funny story about Stanley Ryerson. Around that time, maybe a little bit earlier, he was a candidate for the party. I'm not sure which name the party was using, depending on the year, but up in Quebec City. And Blanche Delina was his, I guess, campaign manager, which meant there was the two of them in the campaign, I guess. So they were doing some door-to-door work in Quebec City. And somebody got wind of it. Some of the fascists up there got wind of it. And they gathered a crowd and started chasing them and throwing stones at them. And they had to literally run for their lives. And they managed to get around the corner, and they knew someone who worked in a funeral parlor. So they ran into the funeral parlor, and the person hid them inside a coffin, the two of them inside one coffin. And the crowd came actually right into the funeral parlor. And the person had to, respect for the dead and all of that, get out of here. But they still hung around outside because they figured they had to be in there because they just disappeared after turning a corner. So to get out of town, they actually had to take them out inside the coffin in the hearse. And it's not an exaggeration. I heard the story from both parties, both from Blanche and from Stanley, years later at different times, and they both told it exactly the same. So quite a little different way to doing election campaigning in those days.
As the party gained in strength, the ruling class continued to drum up anti-communist fervor by any means. In 1937, Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis introduced an act to protect the province against communistic propaganda known as the Padlock Act. Named for the confiscation of meeting spaces by law enforcement, the Padlock Act was wielded by the state against communists and non-communists alike to hasten deportations of recent immigrants and to terrorize religious and political groups. This signaled one of the lowest points during the Cold War in Canada.
Le Parti communiste, loin d'être ce qu'on dit dans nos livres d'histoire, ce qu'on nous apprend au Québec, c'est dans ces années-là, dans les années 30, 40, 50, c'est vraiment une force fondamentale. Il n'y a pas un syndicaliste, un ouvrier au Québec qui n'a pas eu à un moment ou à un autre, à travailler avec des communistes. Le Parti communiste est vraiment un parti massif à cette époque-là. C'est aussi le parti qui lutte contre la loi du cadenas, c'est un parti qui lutte pour la démocratie. Et donc, c'est vraiment un parti qui a une influence très importante dans les masses populaires au Québec. Et c'est pas pour rien, d'ailleurs, que Maurice Duplessis, en 36, impose la loi du cadenas. C'est vraiment pour freiner la propagation de l'idéologie communiste et qu'il voit vraiment comme une menace.
When a communist says that they're fighting for democracy, what they mean is they're fighting for the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's all well and good. But what ends up happening is the centralization of power, regardless. They're Marxist-Leninists too. So they want the state to run everything, right? You have to have elected officials, blah, blah, blah. So they don't mean communism. They don't mean democracy as in a liberal democracy. That's not what they mean. They just infiltrate a liberal democracy. And it's everything that isn't communism must be fascism. So people's disgust or not wanting to have communists around, they'll label, I mean, I get labeled fascist in my comments all the time these days, and I find that quite funny because I'm actually liberal. I actually believe liberalism has the best shot for this country. I believe in merit, but apparently that's fascism because I'm not a communist.
During the Second World War, the Communist Party called for a popular front against fascism. But at the outset of the Cold War, the world was cleaved anew, and the capitalist class renewed its persecution of the global left with vigor. As McCarthyism intensified in the United States, its Canadian accomplices escalated attacks on communists.
We need McCarthy.
Évidemment, parmi les communistes qui sont illustrés au Québec, on peut pas passer outre l'exemple de Fred Rose. Fred Rose demeure jusqu'à aujourd'hui la seule personne à avoir été élue sous la bannière du Parti ouvrier progressiste, qui était
Labour Progressive Party. I'm just self-noting that because I have some feelings on the term progressive.
le nom légal du Parti communiste à cette époque.
Oh, so that was okay. So the progressive, what was it? I need to go back to that.
Outre l'exemple de Fred Rose. Fred Rose demeure jusqu'à aujourd'hui la seule personne à avoir été élue sous la bannière du Parti ouvrier progressiste.
Okay, so the official name of the Communist Party at that time, the Cold War, because in the Cold War, communism was not de rigueur, it was not fashionable, people didn't like it, they had to go underground, subversion, blah, blah, blah. So they called themselves the Labour Progressive Party. That's really interesting because I have come across articles on Marxist.org, like I go and I read some stuff on there sometimes because like I said, it's an archive, a very, very exhaustive archive of all of the communist pamphlets, of anti-fascist stuff, of Marxist, whatever. It's just a huge archive of communist Marxist material. And I've come across quite a lot of documentation on around between the 1930s, was it the 1930s and the 1950s, that communists were basically under the guise of being anti-fascist, would then infiltrate so anti-fascist before the war, but after the war, they would still infiltrate basically what they called progressive alliances. So people who were liberal and I guess communists started calling themselves progressives. There was like a group of lots of different people, but they, just like they infiltrated the labor unions, they infiltrated this idea of progressivism. So to hide the fact that they were communists, they called themselves progressives. Anyway, so I'm going on a long rant to say that's really interesting. I didn't know they were called the Labour Progressive Party in the 1950s, around the time that I know they were basically trying to hide their being communists. It's all tying together.
Progressiste, qui était le nom légal du Parti communiste à cette époque, au niveau fédéral. Et en fait, il n'a pas été élu seulement une fois, il a été élu une deuxième fois. Une première fois en 1944, dans une élection partielle, et une seconde fois en 1946 avec encore plus de votes qu'en 1944, et ce, malgré le fait que les autres candidats s'étaient ligués dans une espèce de coalition anticommuniste anti-Fred Rose. Donc, ça prouve que, en fait, Fred Rose bénéficiait de l'appui des citoyens et des citoyennes du quartier ouvrier dans lequel il s'était présenté. Le quartier, c'était la circonscription, en fait, s'appelait la circonscription de quartier à l'époque. Et dans cette circonscription, on comptait plusieurs usines, des usines d'ailleurs dans lesquelles les communistes étaient très actifs au niveau syndical. Évidemment, Fred Rose, après sa réélection en 1946, est accusé. Et d'ailleurs, c'est on reconnaît ça encore aujourd'hui comme l'un des débuts réel début de la guerre froide. Fred Rose est accusé par le gouvernement d'être un espion à la solde de l'Union soviétique. Entre nous, on va pas se le cacher, je pense que s'il avait fallu qu'il y ait des espions soviétiques au Canada, ils auraient trouvé des bien meilleures couvertures qu'être le seul communiste à la Chambre des communes. Mais bon, et non seulement ça, mais en plus, donc dans un procès qui est éminemment politique. D'ailleurs, Fred Rose n'aura pas droit à une enquête préliminaire, parce que pour avoir droit à une enquête préliminaire, il fallait que le procureur général de la province donne son accord. Et à cette époque, le procureur général de la province de Québec était nul autre que Maurice Duplessis, premier ministre d'extrême droite finalement, qu'on connaît tout le monde comme le maître, le chef de l'époque de la Grande Noirceur. Mais toujours est-il que outre ces procédures judiciaires, le procès est éminemment politique. C'est vraiment un procès anticommuniste et on veut vraiment s'attaquer aux communistes et à leur influence. Et donc, Fred Rose va être condamné, va être envoyé en prison. Il va faire 6 ans de prison et après ces 6 années-là, ne trouvant pas d'emploi, il est obligé de s'exiler dans son pays d'origine, la Pologne.
In all my activities in unions, I'm rubbing elbows with communists here and there, and I've got quite an interest in it all. And actually, what brought me into the party was in 1968 during the Dubček situation. I'm at a union meeting. There's a motion on the floor put there by the executive to condemn Russia for having invaded Czechoslovakia. I got up to speak against the motion. I said, I think most people in this room are socialists or see themselves as socialists. An awful lot of you belong to the NDP. And I believe in socialism, and I believe that when you attain socialism, you should defend socialism. Well, the roof came down and the red baiting was rampant from there on in. So it was the day after that I called up Sam Hammond to say that I'm ready to join the party now.
Since its founding in 1936, the communist-led Canadian Seamen's Union had fought to improve the dreadful working conditions of sailors and dock workers. In 1949, however, the Canadian government conspired with American unions to install notorious gangster Hal Banks within the rival Seafarers International Union, breaking a national strike and permanently destroying the CSU.
Hal Banks was a known gangster, but he was also a real redneck anti-communist. And he was brought here knowing that he was a gangster, set up an office down just off Pender and Sea.
That's crazy. So far, they've not mentioned any of their gangster communists. They're anti-fascist gangsters and thugs.
Anymore. And my dad walked me by that office in the 50s. And there was a sign in the window that said, I'm here, or this organization is here, the SIU, to smash communist unions in BC. It was overt.
This was a dramatic prelude to a decade of suppression, as throughout the 1950s, communist-led unions were expelled from the Canadian Congress of Labour, and red clauses were added to expel communists from unions headquartered in the US. When they were readmitted into the Canadian Labour Congress in the 1960s, right-wing social democracy was in control of the CLC and its affiliates.
That was the time when the right-wing leaders in the trade union movement, the Liberal and CCF leaders in the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, and the CCF right-wing leaders of the Canadian Congress of Labour.
Okay, I think that's significant. They just basically said that Liberals were not left-wingers. They see Liberals as right-wingers. And this is consistent with a lot of stuff that I hear actual socialists, actual Marxists say. So this guy got really upset earlier in the comments that I mentioned that I am, in the true sense, a liberal, not the capital L Liberal Party of Canada, which is not liberal at all, but I guess you could say classical liberal. Like, I believe in free speech and freedom of association and also a whole bunch of other principles, but that's liberalism, which has been completely commandeered by some of these radicals. But they didn't see so-called liberals or classical liberals, they didn't view them as leftists because they weren't leftists. So I think that's actually really significant, and that gets lost now because of the Liberal Party of Canada is an aberration. It's a complete disgrace. It's not actually liberal.
We're expelling left-wing unions right and left, and expelling communists and left-wingers from elected positions in the trade union movement. People like Harold Pritchett, Harvey Murphy, Charlie Stewart, and Jack Phillips. I remember at that time, when this was taking place, Saint Laurent, who was the Prime Minister, was asked, why don't you in Canada pass some legislation like the Taft-Hartley Act in the United States, which would ban communists from holding positions in unions? And his reply was, the unions are doing a good job by themselves. We don't have to do it.
So that's also interesting. So there was a point where communism had become so unpopular that the unions were no longer filled with basically all these socialists that infiltrated it in the past. And they were sort of able to regulate themselves. That's really interesting. Because again, I don't actually think we need to abolish all unions. It's unfortunate that they've been taken over by all of these Marxists, these neo-Marxists, this new version of identitarian communists. But there is a purpose for unions. But they're saying that they were able to well, maybe they do need a lot more regulation. I don't know. I'm no political expert, but I think it's interesting that around, what does this look like, the 70s, that unions had basically eradicated their, what they call left-wing, as in not liberal members.
Because the boss had his representatives in right-wing government, you'd expect intrigue and you'd expect pushback from governments. And the people that they represented were the owners of industry. But in my grandfather's case, and in a number of other unions, but more specific to Harold Pritchett's case, is that not only was he harassed by the McCarthy era, he was also harassed by the White Bloc, it was called, in his own union. And when my grandfather ran for 2 conventions, the first one was by acclamation. He became the president, the founding president. The second time around, I think he got 75 or 78% of the vote at a convention. The White Bloc only ever got 12 or 13 or 14%. So the White Bloc, this was union members that wanted power and intrigue and wear a bow tie and smoke a cigar so badly, they sided with the government and the bosses to get my grandfather excommunicated.
Okay, that's really funny. The White Bloc wanted to wear their dinner suits, their bow ties, and to be close with the government and smoke their cigars. But hang on a minute. I just need, for some people who weren't here in the beginning, I actually started this off by showing how cozy the union bosses are with the government right now as the the tariff war is going on. Justin Trudeau just yesterday posted this whole like celebration of unions and how they're supporting unions and blah blah blah. So guess who the White Bloc is? Guess who the White Bloc actually is? Guess who it actually is? Isn't that funny? Let's go back to watching.
From being able to go over the border to take his rightful place. And he would have won that 3rd election and probably the 4th too, because he was such a good organizer at the grassroots level.
The red clauses were effectively dropped after John Severinsky, a steel worker in Port Colborne, and Jim Bridgewood, an auto worker in Oakville, ran on the Communist Party's ticket in the 1972 federal election.
Communists are usually elected in trade unions, especially at the lower levels, at the shop floor, even during the worst McCarthyite days. Communists were elected as shop stewards and representatives. They're isolated in the leadership of most of the unions. But at the bottom level, the workers are very pragmatic. They know who represents their interests. So they had to put up with the Cold War and McCarthyism, but they still elected communists at the ground level where they need representation every day. I believe that's still the case.
With the founding of the Canadian Peace Congress, the Communist Party would lead the fight for disarmament and mutual security, demanding the outlawing of nuclear weapons alongside other signatories of the Stockholm Appeal as a Canadian affiliate to the World Peace Council.
And sometimes when people say to me at the end of a speech, Tim, you used to talk like a revolutionary. Now you talk like a pacifist. I say to them, well, isn't that a very funny thing? The pacifists don't know it, but they are becoming revolutionaries. They're becoming revolutionaries because to the extent that they help to prevent world war, they are keeping the road open for the advance of socialism.
When I joined the Communist Party of Canada in 1959, the Cold War was in full spate. But there was a bit of a turn. Especially in English-speaking Canada. There was coming to be a peace movement more than just communists and Quakers and a few other Christians. And at the University of Toronto, we succeeded in getting quite a significant movement going. It called for Canada to withdraw from its nuclear alliance, NORAD, with the United States. And there was quite a campaign. In fact, it influenced not just our campaign in the University of Toronto, but the campaign in the country influenced the Diefenbaker cabinet, and they resisted U.S. nuclear overflights during the crisis over Cuba in 1961, and indeed the placing of nuclear tips on Beaumark missiles stationed in Canada.
These issues were not new, but for some reason, it had finally sunk into people, like the danger, the mortal danger of nuclear weapons. And suddenly there was this great upsurge of peace organizations and peace demonstrations and so on. So there were organizations like, Doctors for Peace and Nurses for Peace and Engineers for Peace, and not too long after I joined the party, there was a major event, which was the walk from Cold Lake. Like at that point, the Canadian government had agreed to, cruise missile testing over Alberta. This is because the terrain of Alberta was sufficiently similar to the terrain around Moscow, right? That they were going to test these, self-guided missiles. So there was a walk, like a protest march, where people started walking from Cold Lake to Edmonton. That's hundreds of miles. So it took several weeks, and each, they walked along. Each place they came to, in the evening, they hold a meeting, a local public meeting, explaining the issues, and they started getting quite a bit of press attention. And sort of when they reached Nemeo, several hundred more people went and joined in with the march as they came into Edmonton. And when they got to about 140th Avenue on 97th Street, about another 1,000 came and joined in and marched down 97th Street to Churchill Square. So there were thousands by the time, and then there was another 5,000 or 10,000 waiting in Churchill Square. There was really an upsurge of the peace movement during that era, and the party, of course, party members were deeply involved with that, involved in many different individual organizations, and involved in the various coordinating committees and umbrella groups, and so on, to like that. That march from Cold Lake. Basically, that was party members' idea. They started pushing it and promoting it with the different organizations.
In an era of national liberation, The Communist Party of Canada unwaveringly supported democratic, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and socialist struggles around the world. In South Africa, Palestine, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Grenada, Guyana, Chile, and of course, the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and the DPRK. Throughout the 1960s, the Communist Party pushed for an independent and democratic Canadian foreign policy of peace and disarmament, opposing the imperialist wars in Korea and Vietnam years before the countercultural consensus.
The communist movement and the Communist Party in Canada particularly took up the struggle of the Vietnamese people, just as as we have done in the struggle of peoples all over the world in their fight for independence and democracy, just as we supported Spanish democracy in the Spanish War. And in the case of Vietnam, we decided to send a delegation to Vietnam, to go there, to hold discussions, and then to come back and to tour the country and tell the people of Canada what was really going on in Vietnam. And so in December 1965, Tim Buck and I and Ray Murphy, who was then the editor of the Canadian Tribune, went on a delegation to Vietnam.
From the YCL, I went on a delegation to Cuba as the...
I think what they've just described is when they're talking about trying to pressure Canada to be democratic, they really mean that they're fighting for the international communism, because all those countries seem to be countries at that time that were struggling with socialist uprisings. And I think so-called imperialist America was pushing back against that. Now, I'm not going to say that those wars were a good thing or a bad thing, because that's not what I'm here to do. But yeah, when they talk about democratic, they're fighting for a democratic world, and they're talking about all these countries in South America going through socialist insurgencies, and countries like the Democratic Republic of North Korea and Vietnam, who, it's pretty obvious what they're doing. It's not democracy means something very, very different to the communists. It means the international communism, international socialism. It means the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's kind of what they're fighting for.
YSL leader, I think that was around 1973, 74, the early days after the revolution in 1960.
Oh yeah, look, too, a former school board trustee. We see a lot of those as communists.
61. Very nice delegation of 5 of us who visited different cities. Very, very impressive. I came home thinking, we have a socialist country right in our backyard, and it was wonderful. Later, I did become involved in Cuba solidarity work, and that's been over 40 years since the organization in Toronto of solidarity, the CCFA in Toronto, was founded. So Cuba solidarity is very important. I'm mentioning this because it's part of the communist ideology to support our fellow workers in other countries.
Standing in unconditional support of the self-determination of all nations, the Communist Party fought for Indigenous rights and sovereignty from its early days, calling for a just settlement of Indigenous land claims and decrying the genocidal actions of the Canadian state. Communist Party member and Métis leader Jim Brady was instrumental in the founding of the Métis associations of La Ronge, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, organizing cooperatives throughout the Alberta settlements to build Métis autonomy after the revolutionary example of Louis Riel.
Jim Brady was one of the first Marxist Métis organizers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, the 1920s and 30s, member of the Communist Party. He was one of those people who brought to life the Marxist theory on the national question, our understanding that Indigenous peoples were oppressed nations within the Canadian capitalist state. He helped take that from a theoretical level to a practical level. He and Malcolm Norris were among the Métis leaders who fought for the establishment of Métis colonies pieces of land controlled by Métis people in Alberta during the Great Depression. This was one of the first cases where the land mass that had been stolen from Indigenous peoples in this country in some form was actually returned to their control. Not in a complete way or a comprehensive way, but it did mark a truly transformational moment in terms of the understanding of the struggle for land, that it was not going to be inevitably simply the theft, unending theft and destruction, that there was a possibility of struggling for a different kind of future.
And there you have it. Decolonize, settler colonialism, post-colonialism. A lot of this Indigenous land back stuff, he's basically said that it's Marxist. It's based in Marxist theory. At least he said it himself.
I've always felt that essentially, when you consider the Métis Rebellion, they were, in my opinion, actually an expression of what we would consider to be a national liberation movement. I still feel that as far as a North American Indian is concerned, there will be no real advance for him until that national liberation movement is carried to its completion.
If you look back at
Yeah, liberation. So that's an interesting word too. I keep seeing it over and over and over again in education. As far as I'm concerned, I got to the point now, if it's liberation, it just means communist. And that does go for Black liberation, women's liberation. The liberation movies of the movements of the 60s were heavily pushed by socialist and Marxist groups. And it's such a shame too, because it's not like everything is bad. But unfortunately, when these guys get involved in some of these social issues and only impose Marxism or socialism, it kind of goes tits up in the end and makes the rest of it look like a bad idea. And anyway, so you get some reactionary stuff, but liberation, keep an eye out. Whenever they say liberation, they just mean Marxist.
The last 7-8 decades, anytime there's been a significant uprising of struggles among Indigenous peoples, the Communist Party has been there primarily in a role to win wider support within the trade union movement, the other sections of the population for those struggles, to help put political pressure on governments and the courts to recognize the validity, whether it's fishing rights, whether it's hunting rights, whether it's the struggle to win upholding the treaties that have been signed in the past, to stop breaking those treaties, whether it's new struggles today to return lands that have been seized illegally in the past. So you look at the Oka, Summer of Oka in 1990, for example. Right across the country, communists were involved in setting up solidarity camps, helping to get resolutions passed within the labor movement, publicizing it in our newspapers. We did a tremendous amount of work to help win the people of this country for the understanding that this was an important solidarity struggle that they had to take part in, not just another fight against injustice, but something much more fundamental to the nature of this capitalist country with its colonialist roots.
Anti-impérialiste! 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 Anti-impérialiste!
With the founding of the Parti communiste du Québec in 1965, the conditions for the French and English-speaking working classes to deepen their solidarity were strengthened. The members of the PCQ are also members of the Communist Party of Canada, but the PCQ has a special status based on the recognition of Quebec nationhood by the communist movement. In 1972, communists played a decisive role at the Canadian Labour Congress Convention, in which communist delegates and delegates from Quebec won the convention for recognition of Quebec as a nation.
Puis, évidemment, dans les années post-guerre, le Parti communiste donc se crée en 1965, le Parti communiste du Québec. en tant qu'entité distincte au sein du Parti communiste du Canada, et c'est ce qui permet, entre autres, plusieurs expériences, plusieurs liens avec les différents partis de gauche qui se créent dans les années 60-70. Évidemment, c'est là aussi que le parti met de l'avant il lutte pour une constitution québécoise qui ferait partie, mais tout ça dans le cadre d'une nouvelle constitution canadienne, et que le parti mobilise beaucoup autour de la nécessité d'une nouvelle constitution, de nouveaux pactes et un partenariat égal et volontaire de toutes les nations à travers le Canada. Et c'est ce qui fait que, par exemple, pendant la crise d'octobre 1970, le Parti communiste du Canada est le seul parti qui va avoir l'audace de dire que les causes profondes de cette crise, c'est pas nécessairement les terroristes du FLQ, mais les aventuristes du FLQ, dans les termes qu'on utilise, que le parti utilisait dans les déclarations à cette époque. Mais c'est vraiment le fait que la Constitution canadienne ne reconnaît pas le Québec comme nation, donc, et à plus forte raison, ne reconnaît pas son droit à l'autodétermination. Puis évidemment, le parti est le seul parti communiste du Canada et le seul parti pan-canadien à cette époque à mobiliser les salariés, les progressistes de tout le pays, et en revendiquant le droit à l'autodétermination pour le Québec.
Did he just say, so I'm a little bit rusty on my Canadian history, pardon me here, but was it FLQ, was it them that kidnapped and murdered people at that time? But he's saying they're not the problem. They're not the problem. It's that Canada wouldn't recognize Quebec as a nation.
That you live in. Well, there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed. But it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a
at any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
During the crisis of October 1970, the Communist Party was virtually alone in opposing the War Measures Act, which led to the military occupation of Quebec and the detention of hundreds of innocent people.
So the War Measures Act, I'm pretty sure that became the Emergencies Act, which was then used on the truckers in Ottawa a couple of years ago, which is funny because it's the communists in power now that are really full on for this. My, how times change.
Communists were on Parliament Hill and in cities across the country protesting on the day the act was invoked, despite the imposition of martial law and the suspension of civil and democratic rights across Canada.
And yet all the unions and all the Marxists and all the leftists were enraged that people might want to advocate for their rights not being removed during the trucker convoy. This is incredible. The irony.
In the referendum of 1980 and again in 1995, the Communist Party supported Quebec's right to national self-determination, advocating for a democratic solution to the crisis of confederation, a new constitution based on an equal, voluntary partnership of the nations in Canada, each with the right to self-determination, up to and including the right to independence. Whether opposing the post-war Abbott Plan, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement of 1988, or the catastrophic NAFTA Accord, the Communist Party of Canada has struggled for economic and political independence from the United States, protected the rights of immigrants against xenophobic policy, and defended the working class against North American monopoly capital. Today, the Communist Party continues to oppose the USMCA as a corporate constitution that drives down wages and sets worker against worker in a race to the bottom. With the advent of neoliberalism at the end of the 1970s and the election of Brian Mulroney in Canada, the Communist Party was often a lone voice against policies of free trade, tax cuts, privatization, deregulation, and the evisceration of labor and democratic rights. This was a decade of bitter confrontations with the forces of capital, including austerity governments from across the political spectrum, yet the Communists stood strong throughout. During the Canada-wide general strike of October 1976, the Communist Party worked at every level of the labor movement to shut down plants, factories, and workplaces across the country. When BC's social credit government introduced its draconian restraint budget of 1983, slashing social services and attacking collective bargaining, workers fought back, and the Communist Party was amply represented within the Solidarity Coalition.
I'm going to make a prediction because with the upcoming, I mean, it's pretty likely that Pierre Poilievre is going to be prime minister of the country, and he certainly seems to be against some of this woke incursion, which, look, it's communist, guys. So I hope he does try to do something about the unions and how they've sort of completely gone beyond what is acceptable for unions to be doing. They should be advocating for labor rights, not for socialist takeover of identity and so on and so forth. But I'm going to predict that this is what's going to happen again. Already we have strikes all the time, right? They're always unhappy. They always want more. Nothing is ever good enough. More power, more money. So I reckon that's going to kick off 10 times more. So I hope that Pierre Poilievre has a plan for that.
50 years that I've been in the party, we have seen the complete breakup of the colonial empires, their disintegration, and the liberation of hundreds of millions of people in the colonial world. When I joined the party, there was only one socialist country, and it was laboring through 5-year plans to overcome much of its backwardness. And it's a country that was maligned every day by the media and by right-wing politicians. We saw in the achievement of socialism in the Soviet Union as the beacon for the future, as the example for mankind. We realized that it was the beginning of a whole historic transformation that was bound to grow no matter what imperialism did. And 50 years have certainly proved that. Today, the socialist world is growing in might. It accounts for 25% of the world's production. Today, just contrast socialism and capitalism. Today, in the socialist world, if you read the Soviet press and the press from the other socialist countries, the whole energy and effort of their country is directed towards improving and increasing the standards of living of their people. Every year, there's recorded progress and uplifting of the economic and the cultural and social life of people in the socialist countries, and contrast that with the capitalist countries. It's not so many years ago that they talked about capitalism being a system that will last forever because we've discovered the welfare state, and the capitalist system will keep giving people more and more material goods and a better life. Today, what are they telling the working people in every capitalist country, including here in British Columbia? They're telling you that you've got to make sacrifices to save the system. And capitalism is going in reverse. And at some point in history, that process is going to become evident to the majority of humanity. The example between declining capitalism and growing socialism. And you know, when I was sitting at the BC Federation of Labour Convention, many of you were there as delegates. This last one, the Unity Convention, which met to discuss the solidarity issue and the right-wing program of the government. And I thought, I don't know how many of you got similar ideas when you were sitting at that convention. Here were representatives of every industry in the province of British Columbia. Here was the real power in BC. There isn't a wheel that would turn. There isn't a board of lumber that would be produced. There isn't a pound of coal that would be produced. There isn't a railway train that would have run. If the people in that hall had made up their mind that they wanted to exercise that power. I thought if that group sitting in that hall made up their mind on the kind of legislation British Columbia wanted, they had the power to go out and get it, despite the opposition of that gang that sits in Victoria.
If this is 1976, I think it was 1976, and he's complaining about capitalism going backwards or whatever, I'm pretty sure that this is the time of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who did kind of impose a sort of Fabian socialist ideal upon Canada. And so I see this a lot, is that the socialists will complain about the failures of the imposition of their own ideology, but then blame so-called capitalism, whatever that means, for the problem. I see this frequently.
And what does that prove? It proved that there exists in society today, in capitalist society, a force, the working class and its allies, that are powerful enough, strong enough to be able to carry through social change, which we were not able to carry through in the days when I joined the party, despite the big unemployed struggles. And what's lacking? The concept among that audience and the working people that they don't have that power. They don't yet recognize that they have the power, but they're not yet ideologically prepared to use that power to establish themselves as the ruling class, which ultimately, though that's the social force that will come to power in this country. But that force exists in Canada today and in our province, and we saw that BC Federation of Labour Convention. So tremendous strides have been made in the 50 years since I joined the party, and I'm sure that many more strides will be made.
With the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the global communist movement lost its lodestar, the world's first and oldest socialist state. As communists around the world strove to understand the counter-revolution, a faction in the leadership of the Communist Party, led by George Hewison, sought to abandon Marxism-Leninism altogether. Veteran communists across the country held strong in a 4-year-long struggle against the liquidationist line and policies of the Hewison Group. Before it was finally defeated, the faction had gained control of the Central Committee, attempted to seize the party's assets, and engaged in several waves of expulsions, ending with a demand that the membership sign loyalty oaths at the end of 1992. The struggle ended with the liquidationists finally leaving the party, with some of its assets, including the party's newspaper, and just 15% of the membership. At the 30th CPC convention, the party's commitment to Marxism-Leninism was reaffirmed, and Miguel Figueroa was elected as its new leader.
How could we think that the Communist Party of Canada would be immune from a global crisis and a global shake that happened when the Soviet Union was dismantled?
The inter-party crisis in the early 90s took a big toll on our party. Not only did we lose members as a result of the crisis, a handful of which, of course, were liquidators, but many others as well who were confused or upset about the paralysis for over 2 years in the party. And so that was a big impact on us. Of course, we also lost financially. Bank accounts had been stripped. Our headquarters at 24 Cecil Street and other party properties were essentially taken away from us. So we had to start from scratch organizationally. We also had big challenges organizationally in the sense that many of our clubs needed to be reactivated. In some cases, they needed to be reorganized and so on. But the biggest toll was the fact that together with everything that had transpired internationally, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the reversion to capitalism in most of Eastern Europe and so on, there was this impression that Marxism was dead, socialism was dead, and by extension, communist parties were dead as well. And in fact, we know that some communist parties actually did disappear. We didn't. We kept the party going and strove to rebuild the party. But there was this general impression that the Communist Party was no more. And on top of that political impact, we found out in the late spring of 1993 that the Mulroney government had introduced new legislation, amendments to the Canada Elections Act, which essentially created conditions for the banning of our party.
In 1993,
That's interesting because I'm pretty sure that the Liberal NDP coalition today have changed electoral laws to essentially ban the PPC. Interesting fact.
The Communist Party led the fight against conservative amendments to the Canada Elections Act, which aimed to eliminate small parties from participating in elections except as independents. Unable to register, parties would not be able to raise funds, issue tax receipts, or campaign for public support. This would be the fourth time that the Communist Party was effectively banned and had its assets seized, only by bureaucratic rather than outright repressive means. Party leader Miguel Figueroa launched a charter-based legal fight that ended before the Supreme Court of Canada after 2 appeals. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled unanimously that the offending sections of the Elections Act were unconstitutional, forcing the government to enact significant changes. That decision, known as Figueroa v. the Attorney General of Canada, marked an important victory in the struggle to democratize Canada's electoral laws to the benefit of the public and all small parties across the political spectrum.
All small parties across the political spectrum. Now, I'm not in support of the PPC or not in support of the PPC, but the PPC today is a small party that has bureaucratic energy behind essentially getting rid of them because apparently they're labeled as far-right extremists and blah, blah, blah. So it's interesting. It seems to me that in the 1990s, those who went through this process learned that you could use bureaucratic power to silence your enemies. And that's basically what they went ahead and did. Oh, and I wonder who this is. So I'm just going to say this for my friends who might be watching. Is this Panillo? Is this Panillo, the trustee from DDSB?
The case, interestingly, was called the Figueroa case. And the reason it was called the Figueroa case was that the party, once it was deregistered, had no standing. We weren't a charitable organization. We weren't a nonprofit organization. We were a political party. And once we ceased to be a political party in the eyes of the government and in the eyes of the Canadian legal system, we had no status at all. So, in fact, it was Figueroa on behalf of the members of the Communist Party versus the Attorney General of Canada. That victory was very significant. Of course, it didn't qualitatively change the nature of the bourgeois electoral system in this country, but it did provide some space for the democratization of the electoral system and to create a bit more of a level playing field. Of course, we know that money comes into it, other perks that exist for the large, particularly the parliamentary parties in Ottawa. But nevertheless, it was a very important victory and, in fact, set a precedent for a number of subsequent judgments, both at the level of the Supreme Court, but also in provincial courts and whatnot, referencing the Figueroa case and the judgment of the court on that case. So these were part of the struggles that we undertook to rebuild the party in the immediate aftermath of the crisis.
So if the communists support democratizing the electoral process and this set a precedent in the courts, it'd be interesting if anybody watching this is sort of legally minded to go look into what's happening to the PPC right now, because it seems like this is quite hypocritical.
I think that period that many people in Canada won't remember because they weren't politically active, I think we have not only pushed through that period, we've rebounded from that. The movement is growing. The movement is not embracing Marxism-Leninism as if it's a dogma, but that as if it's a scientific world view that needs to help guide us. And so if I trace my own thinking from 1986, when I was very impressed with what the Soviet Union had managed to accomplish, that was only a small piece of why I felt proud to be a communist. As I travel now to other world socialist countries and go to China and go and talk with other comrades around the world, I know that we're in a very, very different period, that people who would not have looked at the Communist Party's platform, programs, or demands are now asking questions, are willing to look at talking about socialism in Canada. And while it may not be on the front burner right now, our task is to keep socialism in Canada on the agenda, within reach, and within people's understanding that it would be a solution to the capitalism we experience now.
Throughout the 1990s, the Communist Party continued to fight against unlimited corporate free trade agreements, tax cuts, privatization, deregulation, attacks on labor and democratic rights, and provincial austerity, and participated in countless picket lines, strikes, and demonstrations. During Ontario's Days of Action, a protracted series of demonstrations against the brutal austerity of Conservative leader Mike Harris, the Communist Party participated in mass protests and citywide strikes in 11 cities across the province, some of the largest actions in Ontario's history.
Is that why Doug Ford won't do anything about the woke communists taking over education, taking over the law, taking over medicine, just taking over everything? Because he's afraid that they'll protest en masse, because they will. They will not only protest en masse, but they will shut things down. They will bring lawfare. Like, we know that's going to happen. But is that why he won't address it? Why he keeps sort of propping them up? That doesn't make any sense, because it's not like he's just ignoring them. He's gone around praising unions. Lana Payne, who runs Unifor, I think was named the most influential person in Toronto not that long ago. So they have a lot of power, and he's all there shaking hands with them, supporting them, ignoring all the videos I make about education. What is up with these people?
The teachers' unions have called an illegal strike. What's in our plan to reform education that could possibly justify breaking the law? Asking teachers to spend a little more time with their students, putting an end to larger class sizes, standardized, understandable report cards, province-wide testing? I don't think so. We live in a law-abiding society. Breaking the law is not the right example. Let's put our children first.
That sounds great.
In 1997, the Communist Party marched with 126,000 Ontario school teachers in an illegal 2-week strike, breaking Harris's attempts to slash school budgets. Party members were active in unions and the community, some in leadership positions. 3 were public school trustees at the time, working closely with the unions to stop the government attacks and build the Days of Action into a province-wide strike, averted when the right-wing leaders of some unions caved at the last minute.
I ran twice for school board.
Let me tell you, whatever the problem was back then with teachers, unions, and with educators, it's 100 times worse now. It's 1,000 times worse. So whatever happened then would be far, far worse. It's almost like someone has to be willing to completely either eliminate the system altogether and start afresh somewhere else, or create a parallel system that people can choose, like competition within the types of education that you can sign up for your own family. Because if all of this stuff is happening in the public sector, and it's going to be way, way, way worse to try to get it out. Like, people do not I've been studying education for like the last 2 years, the radical bits, and it is embedded from the top to the bottom to everywhere. Okay. So yeah, an interesting idea is creating competition within the market. So whether it's school choice or charter schools or just lots of different choice that people can actually choose. I don't know what the solution is. I'm still trying to work that out. But yeah, whatever was happening then would be a lot worse now if somebody came along and said, sorry, guys, you can't do woke socialism in the classroom anymore.
Third time I won, it was in the city of York. Third time I had learned to get good pictures and good signs and to really go about it. Someone asked me, why are you running? Is it to raise issues or do you want to get elected? And I said, I want to be elected. It turned out that I was elected. I was the first communist in Toronto that I know of in this period.
That is not true. That is not true, because this must be in the 90s. Now, I did a video series on a man called Patrick Case. Patrick Case in the early 70s ran on a Communist Party of Canada ticket to become a school board trustee at the Toronto District School Board. So there's videos on my YouTube channel that you can go watch about this. Now, this man spent an awful lot of time as a trustee building a lot of socialist policies within the Toronto District School Board, then became a lawyer, and then joined the Ministry of Education under the Equity Secretariat. And the Equity Secretariat has a lot of power in the Ministry of Education today. So she is not the first communist trustee. The first, maybe not first, but way before her was Patrick Case.
To be endorsed by the Toronto Labour Council. And when I was elected, it was really quite a thing to learn how to work with other trustees on the board who had different viewpoints, and to learn how to raise the issues in such a way to get the attention, asked a lot of questions because I didn't have enough support to get the votes. But I also worked very closely with the union people, because to me, if you're a progressive elected person, it's very important to work with unions. Our constituents, many of...
If you're a progressive elected person, she's a communist. She went on a Communist Party ticket and she's calling herself a progressive. This is no mistake. Progressivism is just a fusion of, it's a bastardization of liberalism with Marxism. No mistake that she just called herself a progressive. And earlier in the film, they were talking about how the Communist Party of Canada, I think it was in the 50s, during the McCarthy era, changed their name to the Labour Progressive Party. And again, I read on Marxist.org, lots of documentation explaining how communists had to basically call themselves progressive so that they were taken more seriously. No mistake.
Them are working people and our union people. And so the issues that they face in terms of collective bargaining and working conditions at the schools is just as important.
After the forced consensus of the neoliberal 1990s, the 21st century began with some of the largest demonstrations against globalization in the history of capitalism. At the G20 summit in Toronto, generations of communists were present. A few years earlier, in April 2001, the Communist Party of Canada and the Young Communist League convened in busloads upon Quebec City for the third summit of the Americas, alongside 70,000 protesters from trade unions and social justice groups. As police attacked the crowds with tear gas and plastic bullets, the crowd pressed onward, controlling the streets and shaping public opinion against the proposed free trade area of the Americas.
I remember that.
The YCL has a very long and proud history. It was founded by members of the Communist Party under clandestine conditions. The War Measures Act was still ongoing. And throughout its history, there's been ebbs and flows. There's been points where the YCL has dissolved, and there's been points where it's been a mass organization. But I think like one of the constants is the autonomy that the party has given the YCL, the room and the space for young people to learn from each other, both theory, but I think more importantly, how to be involved into the movement, how to be a militant. And so there's always been this space and opportunity for young people to grow together and work as a collective, under the guidance of the the party, and the veterans bringing their experience, but also with enough, breathing room to be able to change and adapt to the conditions.
The Communist Party and Young Communist League marched with the Quebec student strike in 2012, demanding free post-secondary education and the cancellation of all student debt, while working to break the firewall isolating Quebec students from their allies across Canada. These were difficult years for Labour, and the Communist Party stood with workers in moments of triumph and strain, victory and betrayal. In 2009, the Communist Party picketed with steelworkers in Sudbury during a year-long strike against Vale Inco for pensions. And in 2016, Communists stood with the staff of the Halifax Chronicle-Herald for an 18-month strike as the newspaper's publisher tried by all means to break the union and the workers' resolve.
There wasn't, a lot of organizing or protests happening in the city I was from during high school. But on the news, all the time, like there was the Quebec student strike, the Idle No More movement, BLM. And so we were seeing all these things and we were excited about them. We wanted to take part of them. And then going, to Toronto, for my first YCL schools, and getting to meet people from across the province that had been engaged in big, historic victories, like passing BDS resolutions, on their campuses, taking part in the Quebec.
BDS is something divest. This is what the Palestine protesters are demanding right now. And isn't it funny? We've watched this. I thought it is about the Communist Party, but it's about Canada's unions. So this film is basically saying that Canada's unions and the Communist Party and the socialist takeover, whatever, they're inextricably linked. That's kind of what I'm getting from this. But also, I guess we're coming into woke era, but there's only a few minutes left, so we'll see.
Back 2012 student strikes, and organizing in that movement. So it was amazing, coming in and coming to these schools where, it wasn't just Mark said this 200 years ago, but it was no, 2 months ago, we, took part in this action. We spoke to these students, we got them out to this rally. And it was, it was really exciting.
Yeah, and the university students, after what happened on October 7th, it was the university campuses across North America, but also a little bit Britain, but definitely Canada and the US, who essentially became protest sites. They had encampments, and I think Toronto, the University of Toronto had the longest Palestine encampment, which had a whole barrier around it. Professors were in the encampment. I mean, Cupie was all over the place. Fred Hahn with his, little Cupie signs. I mean, it was pretty insane. Yeah.
From the struggles of Mi'kmaq fishers to Wet'suwet'en land defenders, the Communist Party has rallied to Indigenous nations' struggles against ongoing colonial oppression and dispossession, connecting working-class movements to Indigenous self-determination as a matter of international solidarity. Where capitalist accumulation pushes ecosystems to the brink of collapse, and the climate asserts itself as a field of political struggle, generations of communists the world over raise a time-worn banner with renewed conviction: socialism or barbarism. As a global pandemic announces the next capitalist crisis, millions of people across Canada face unemployment, impoverishment, and the threat of eviction. While sharpening contradictions between classes recall the social and economic turmoil of the Great Depression, and a new Cold War looms on the horizon, the lessons of history are remembered, preserved by the party, tested in struggle, and constantly developed alongside the needs and experience of the working class. For 100 years, the Communist Party of Canada has held strong to its program of proletarian internationalism and socialism, and as the crises of capitalism mount in the present, its future is assured. The Communist Party remains Canada's party of scientific socialism, tempered by a century of rich history, with many more years of growth and struggle ahead.
Well, I guess that's the end. There you have it. I guess the choices that you have to make: communism or barbarism. I guess that's our choices. That's the only choices going forward in this new age, according to the Communist Party of Canada. I just wanted to have, just for fun's sake, I want to just have a look at some of the more recent union activity. Oh, let's have a look at what I put to one side. Oh yeah, check it out. So they were talking about Palestine. Now, this was in 2021. This film was made. So I guess they were filming and producing it in 2020. So the pandemic had started, but the pro-Palestine Hamas stuff had not started. And so here we have Fred Hahn. This is what the unions are today. So hardly what you would call right-wing, I suppose. And they're cozy with our government currently during this tariff war. What else have I got? Oh, this is another union thing. This is from the OSSTF, another teachers union promoting drag queen stuff, queering the classroom. What else have I got? Because I pulled a few out because I knew it'd be about unions, but I'm not sure what I've got here. Oh, this is an interesting one. So this is Justin Trudeau's post with the unions heavily promotes Unifor. Lana Payne from Unifor is an interesting character. She was part of the anti-parent union call before the Million March for Children. She's in it, with all the rest of the 15 unions that I was able to identify. But this is a training that I came across and this is a couple of the union members speaking here.
We know that even in our union, there's a large number, I think now it's over 30%, are actually voting for the Conservative Party, as an example, leading into the next election. And what we're prepared to do as a union is have tough conversations. As I mentioned in that spectrum of membership engagement, our goal by having one conversation at a time leading up to the next federal election is to just actually move our members one position over to the left. So if you're talking about having those tough conversations with your conservative friends as well, it's similar. It's not shying away from those deep level structured organizing conversations. It's having tough conversations. It's staying true to yourself, but it's about educating, inoculating, like what Billy said, inoculating one conversation at a time. That person's not going to wake up tomorrow and just all of a sudden be a leftist, progressive individual. They're probably going to move over one stage, just maybe not spouting off their conservative values as much the next conversation. Then you're going to go back in and you're going to have another conversation and educate and inoculate that person. And maybe the next time they'll move one more step to the left.
Not being a leftist or a communist, according to these two Unifor representatives, is a disease that must be inoculated. They have 30% conservative voting members that they're trying to move, just nudge, so that they don't feel so comfortable spouting their conservatism. I mean, this is pretty incredible. Somebody said earlier in the comments that the unions have protection against political discrimination. No, they don't. Even if it's in there, they're never going to reinforce that. The union literally here is telling you they need you to be a leftist. They need you to be a communist. And if you're not, we know in teachers' unions, teachers who have pushed back against some of this woke stuff in school, they don't get represented. Their unions turn against them. So there is no protection. They need you to be leftist. They will nudge you. They will push you in the next election to just be a little bit more leftist so that you can feel less comfortable spouting your views, which are not communist. I love this video and I wish it would have got more traction at the time, because I don't know. I just wish people understood how crazy these unions have become. Oh, and this is another video. This is not quite unions, but this is sort of underlining my point about progressivism. This is very, very recently. This is Wes Streeting, who is the health minister in the UK right now, the Labour Party. Labour also kind of... so the Labour Party was actually founded by the Fabian Society, and the Fabian Society is a socialist society from like the 1950s or something. 1850s. But they're not Marxists. They're different kind of socialists. They're incrementalists. Anyway, so this is the Labour Party, Wes Streeting, speaking about what his understanding of progressivism is. And I think this really describes what I've been trying to tell people that I've been learning. And he just outrightly says it. Let's listen.
But let's start big picture. I'm very clear what Donald Trump
what Nigel Farage, what their politics is, what they think the aim and objective of their politics is, it can be less clear what the point of progressive politics is in the 21st century. What is it?
It's the same as it's ever been, which is the redistribution of power, wealth, and opportunity. So it sits in the hands of the many, not the few. That is the kind of core ethos, the core set of values, the driving objective of Labour politics.
But
Okay, let's just repeat what he just said. He just said the point of progressivism, it's the same that it's ever been, which is the redistribution of power, wealth, and opportunity. That is the core ethos, the core set of values, the driving objective of Labour/progressive politics. I mean, there's only one ideology that I know of that is obsessed with redistributing wealth and power. So, I mean, there you go. He just kind of says it. Let's see what else I have before we end this stream today. Oh, here's the video that I was talking about. This is talking about Patrick Case, who in the 60s, was it late 60s, early 70s? I can't remember the exact date, but he joined the Communist Party. He came from the UK. His family went from the Caribbean to the UK during the Windrush, and then he came to Canada in the late 60s to Toronto, and then joined the Communist Party. And he then became a trustee on the Communist Party ticket. He eventually got dropped by the Communist Party. I'm not entirely sure why. But he went on to be an incredibly successful person in education in Canada. I read a book from Tim McCaskill, who calls himself the granddaddy of gay liberation, again, liberation in Canada, who's a self-proclaimed Marxist, who wrote a book called Race to Equity, who describes the adventures of the extremist, far leftist, if you will, Marxist trustees at the TDSB. Anyway, super interesting. I would like everyone to watch this, because this person actually, Patrick Case, who is, I mean, he's a communist, let's be honest, he ran the Equity Secretariat in the Ministry of Education in Ontario, the Equity Secretariat. I find that to be very Soviet sounding. He has since left there, but Jill Dunlop, our Minister of Education, appointed Patrick Case to investigate the Toronto District School Board who took children to a pro-Palestine protest. Now, do you think a communist who is an Equity Secretariat guy is actually going to do a good job investigating the far leftists for far leftist actions, who are protected by the far leftist unions who want to push all their conservative members to the left? I mean, this is also ridiculous that this is even going on. But yeah, so all the information is receipted and referenced in case you're interested in it. What else have I got? Oh, I'm just going to play this one last thing, and then I'll end the stream for today because it's gone on quite long enough. So here in May this year, we had OPSU. This is a member of OPSU called Julius Ascot in Toronto, and this is around the height of the pro-Palestine stuff going on.
To the Executive Board of the Ontario Public Service and Employees Union. Julius continues as president of OPSU Local 532, based in the Ministry of the Environment. He remains a vocal proponent of Palestinian rights and for class struggle unionism. So, without further ado, give it up for Julius.
Good afternoon, sisters, brothers, comrades, and friends. International Workers' Day, May the 1st, represents more than a celebration of past gains, such as higher wages, improved benefits, better working conditions, and shorter hours. International Workers' Day signifies the class struggle to abolish capitalism and to establish a system which is free of exploitation and oppression.
So we just have this guy who, I think he works in the environmental, something, the Ministry of the Environment or something, just out on the street, just calling for the socialist revolution to like abolish capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And nobody's up in arms about this. I mean, I find that a little bit crazy that this is Canada. So yeah, that's it. That's all I have for everyone today. I hope you enjoyed watching that. I actually learned quite a bit watching that, mostly towards the end. But yeah, I mean, the main takeaway that I got from watching this film, I knew it was going to be about unions to a certain extent, but I didn't realize how much it was going to be about unions. And it felt like in the beginning, it was communism, I guess. But in the long run, it really just a story about how the communists essentially took over the unions, and that's how they seized power. Now, the Communist Party itself doesn't seem to me that they have an awful lot of power right now. They seem like a bit of a nothing burger. But they sort of dispersed into other areas. So these identitarians, I guess, these progressives that we call them today are definitely within the Liberal Party of Canada. The NDP seems to be the Union Party of Canada. So there's where all your union Marxists are. And then there's another worrying trend that I'm seeing is I think they're called the Revolutionary Communist Party. They launched last year. They mostly seem to be very young people, but they do seem to be active on campus grounds, trying to recruit young people. And I spoke to them. I went to their launch, I guess you could say, I think it was last April. So just before this OPSU thing that I just showed you. And I had a chat with some of their members as they were marching through the city, and they just, bless them, they were young people. They were caught up in this. They were very idealistic. They had no idea what they were talking about. They were defending the most atrocious things that socialist dictatorships have imposed. And all this indoctrination has been going on for decades, right, through the education system. So, yeah, I feel like it's my job to try to just as much as possible help remove some of the craziest excesses of these people. And also, I just wanted to say, you saw the Marxist fist throughout this video over and over and over again from the very beginning. So they're talking about the 1920s in the beginning, always the Marxist fist. Now, in the video, the Patrick Case video, I do mention that he was very much against political extremism, which is great. I'm also against political extremism. I don't really want it in the classroom. But what they mean is their political extremism is fine, because if we look, socialism is by definition far left, but somehow they've managed to rehabilitate the image of socialism. Somehow over the years, that image has been rehabilitated. And I think a lot of that is because of the way socialists have infiltrated the education system through unions and other means, through the university as well as through teacher colleges. So the image of socialism has been rehabilitated. And so they don't see the Marxist fist as a politically extreme symbol. And it is everywhere. Now, I think if you want to be against a swastika and you don't want political extremism, then you should probably also be against the Marxist fist and be very wary of anyone who's trying to sell you on the idea of socialism. So that's it from me. I will see you next week.